I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1272nd New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Laura Raicovich, Alexandra Juhasz, Gil Hochberg, Jill Casid, and Nicholas Mirzoeff. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Laura Raicovich is a New York City-based writer and curator known for her critical work on cultural institutions and dedication to more equitable cultural production. Alexandra Juhasz is a distinguished professor of film at Brooklyn College CUNY. She makes and studies committed media practices that contribute to political change and individual and community growth. Gil Hochberg is Ransford Professor of Hebrew and Visual Studies, Comparative Literature, and Middle East Studies, and Chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, South Asian Studies, and African Studies at Columbia University in New York. And our hosts today, artist, theorist, and historian Jill H. Casid holds the appointment of Professor of Visual Studies in the Departments of Art History and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Nicholas Mirzoeff has been writing and teaching about Jewishness in Palestine for over 2 decades. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jill to get us started.
Oh, welcome everyone. I see so many friends, colleagues, comrades here with us today. We've gathered to revisit and extend the conversation that we began in February 2025 when Nick Mirzoeff and I convened a roundtable at the College Art Association conference in New York. And the text of that roundtable is forthcoming in the Journal of Visual Culture, and a shout out here to senior editor Mark Smith, who's joined us. And I want to mention that included in that roundtable is Amanda Schubert, who was unfortunately not able to join us today. In the wake of the genocide in Gaza and in confrontation with settler colonialism, particularly Zionist settler colonialism and Christian Zionist settler coloniality, Nick and I asked contributors, what is the decolonial task for those engaged in visual culture and identified as Jewish, or who attempt to work and speak from the position rendered near impossible of the anti-Zionist Jew? The roundtable participants and contributors who are able to join us today, Gil Hochberg, Alexandra Juhasz, and Laura Raicovich, articulate different positions, but our call recognizes how those of us who may work in solidarity with Palestine, who may support the movement to decolonize, who may understand settler colonialism as structure, not event, who may feel ourselves hailed and hailed differently as genocidal and authoritarian violences are carried out in the false name of the Jewish safety it violates. Considering the counterinsurgency in the wake of the student solidarity encampments and global uprising in solidarity with Palestine, we asked, how can the widely shared rhetoric of and movement for decolonization in the university, especially since South African students took down the Rhodes statue in 2015 and issued the call to decolonize the curriculum, be rethought, reimagined, carried on in ways that also confront the weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism? And we are still asking those questions. I want to turn here to a personal acknowledgement. As the queer descendant of dispossessed Jews, many of whom did not survive, I refuse the weaponization of my grief and losses as fuel for the Israeli state's genocidal war machine, condemn the assaults on artistic, academic, and journalistic freedom, and the double standards with regard to boycotts and calls for divestment and sanctions. And in their names and my own, I'm with Palestine still, in naming to dismantle the genocidal apartheid regime of our time, and doing so as a praxis of love. I also recognize that in the United States, we're hardly outside settler colonial occupation. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation, without material consideration of land back, the right of return, reparations, and abolition of the carceral state and colonial occupation. Acknowledgement is, of course, never enough. Let us then not just acknowledge, but also hold open the possible portal that holding this convening presents as a chance to send the reverberations of a no to the false equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, no to selective solidarity, no to white supremacy, and doing so is the channel for a binding bond among the uncounted in the condition of a worldlessness that in my own work I've been calling the necrocene, to bring closer reckoning with the catastrophe that's already occurred, and yet within this worldlessness, a palpable sense that there are still ways of doing things with being undone, to insist on the supports for livable life, for Palestinian, Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, refugee, migrant, and trans life. We're going to start today's conversation with a framing introduction by my comrade, Mirzoeff, and then we're asking everyone to respond to 2, possibly 3, depending on how we keep to time, prompts, going in alphabetical order by first name. So beginning with Alex, then turning to Gil, and then to Laura, with a couple of minutes each. So with that, let me turn things over to Nick.
Thank you, Jill. Good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you from Lenape-Hoking, the unceded lands of the Lenape people, as Jill mentioned in her case. And I'm looking out of the window of the Triangle Shirtwaist Monument, where 111 women and girls died to found the trade union movement. So we speak from history here. And in thinking about how to do the impossible, which is to introduce this conversation, I was entirely unable to do it. I was up all night. I rewrote it several times. So I'm going to talk to you more informally than Jill did, because I can't manage this. I'm so grateful for the comradeship of the people who've been on this roundtable, who worked with us in varying formations to resist this appalling genocide and the insurgent fascism in the United States. I'm very grateful to Brooklyn Rail for giving us this venue, for having the courage, where many of our institutions have failed, to give us this platform. And I'm especially grateful to people who've taken time out of your lives to join us today. I see so many names here with whom we have often walked. So it's just a delight and a pleasure to be with you, even under these circumstances. So it's 2 years. It's 2 years. And I think everything has changed, at least for me. I can't speak. I'm not speaking for anybody other than myself in this so-called introduction. But it feels to me as everything has changed. It's a ceasefire, but it's not. People are still dying. 53% of Gaza is still under occupation. But it is clearly an inflection point. As thinkers and critics and activists, I think we recognize this moment as a moment in which another form of intervention will be needed. We'll want to think about today what that might look like, how we might do it. I've been thinking for a while with Silvia Federici's phrase, Palestine is the world. And it has resonated across this 2 years. How does it sit today? It tells us what capitalism really is, the extent to which its violence, its rapaciousness, its extraction is always already racialized and continues to be, and continues to insist on that almost above everything else. And yes, it's a time of subtle colonialism in a way that was perhaps more obfuscated in years past and is now, it seems to me, entirely visible. In 2023, I talked about the way that the checkpoint in Palestine was the paradigm visual institution of our time, much more so than the long outdated panopticon. And of course, it remains so. And we see checkpoints across this country in Los Angeles, in Portland, in Chicago, and wherever ICE are in operation. But it's also a time, and this has happened in the course of this genocide, in which that checkpoint regime has become distributed and automated through the quadcopter war that has been fought in Gaza. And this will be something that I think will want to concern us, the way in which the disciplinary and punitive viewpoint is now distributed and automated. So how do we activate this visible? How do we make it into something that we can work with? We might want to begin with our comrade in Jewish Voice for Peace, Sarah Schulman's definition of solidarity as recognizing that other people are real. I mean, in this case, very obviously, the Palestinians are real. And that sounds like such a basic thing to say, and of course it is. But it's something that hasn't yet been fully done, and we need to continue to work with that. When we give other people the right to look, which is best to say we give them the right to look at us, that forms a real. That's a real that we can continue to create, and that we are creating here. In my own work, because I can't speak about anything else, right? I've talked about this idea of to see in the dark, a place that's outside the glare of surveillance capitalism. And I talked about two methods that we might use there, one of which was rubble, which is an idea that I took from an intersection between John Berger and Mahmoud Darwish many years ago. But if we think about the practical conditions of Gaza now, there are 60 million tons of rubble in the Gaza Strip. That's an unimaginable quantity, and it would take an estimated 25 years to remove. There are about an estimated 10,000 people who are incarcerated still within that rubble. So that time frame, that 25 years, says to me that this is not then temporary. This is now a permanent condition with which we're going to work. I mean, if I'm lucky, that's the rest of my life. For younger people, perhaps a different dimension. The second thing is video that I spoke about. And we saw how short form video created the global intifada that Joe mentioned, the ways in which we interacted with what we saw on our phones, on our devices, that were so different from what we were being shown by mainstream media, and that caused people to rise up. And I wanted to say today that what I think we also learned from those kinds of forms, both from things like sludge video on TikTok and from multimedia video art, is that the window on the world that's presented as a targeting device by the drone or the quadcopter or by single view perspective needs to be challenged. We need to think about new horizons. I want to just suggest two. One would be what the late David Graeber called baseline communism. That is, instead of doing a baseline in the middle in the window for perspective, we think about the need to create sociality as the baseline for our way to create the real. And that's what we saw at the encampments. We've seen this, I think, many times in recent decades, that when we want to start again, we do it in public space, we do it with a tent and a kitchen and an assembly and some handwritten signs. Baseline anti-state within the state. And secondly, and relevant to our conversation here today, is what I want to call an abolition communism. Meaning for me, how will we abolish what I see as carceral Jewishness? That is to say, we all know, everyone knows here, that the occupation is a carceral state, that it creates a carceral continuum, that it uses British law and indeed British physical structures to contain people in prisons. But I think we need to think then about decolonizing then as undoing that connection between carcerality and the Jewish identity that has been claimed by the occupation. Fanon spoke about the systemic dehumanization of colonialism. So our work would then be to do what, it's not a pretty word, but it's not a pretty process, undehumanization. So what is the way then to undehumanize carceral Jewishness? How we think about that, how we undertake that. And we don't have to do that in Palestine. We can do it within our own locations, within our own communities. And particularly, I want us to finally think about our institutions, which have failed us so spectacularly. And obviously, Gil can talk about that very directly, but it's every bit as much the case here at NYU. So in gathering like this, we are about creating, I think, what I want to call an underground, a place and a practice of resistance, a place where we can work this out together, as we often have. And these are my thoughts in place of an introduction, which I couldn't manage to do.
Thank you so much, Nick. And we wanted to share out a little bit of the roundtable, which for those of you who've joined us is forthcoming from the Journal of Visual Culture. And we are asking big asks of our comrades here to please each summarize a couple of key points from your contribution to the roundtable that seem pertinent today in just a couple of minutes. And Alex, we're hoping to start with you.
My pleasure. And I took that very seriously. So I've written this part just to make sure I don't go over time, be a little more informal for the other questions. I did want to thank Brooklyn Rail for being wonderful hosts, and for my fellow panelists, Nick and Jill, for your leadership, but also Laura and Gil. Like we are all learning this together. It's a real-time process. It's always changing. I need my allies and comrades. I've learned so much from all of you and from the work we've done together. And I will just have to say, following Jill's lead, I'm the child of a living Holocaust survivor, Joseph Juhasz. He's an academic. He hid in the basement of his home as a child in Budapest. There were bombs falling on him, and he was starved and nearly died. And he's a pacifist because of what he learned. And so am I, because of what my father learned. And I will not have his story be used against how he understands his story. And that is one of the reasons I'm here, but not the only reason. So my piece for the roundtable and for its publication is called Windows for Witness, Dan Fishback's Radical Access. And I begin that piece and I quote, "I attended Dan Fishback is alive, well, and living in his apartment from a chaise lounge in my living room in Flatbush, Brooklyn on 15th December 2024. And this is how he describes the piece. Dan Fishback is alive, unwell, and living in his apartment is a rock musical theater song cycle about a chronically ill gay bitch trapped at home during a time of global fascism and a mass disabling pandemic, wondering how to spend the rest of his life, living in a nightmare, performed twice in December 2024, online and in person." I write, "The tender, playful, raucous, and angry show draws out the dark contours of this nightmare, a constellation of pain and despair born from chronic illness and genocide." As I go on to explain, his piece was built through a process called radical access, making his art available to me online, where I watched it on my chaise lounge, but also to people with a range of access needs who were live at 2 performances held at and supported by Joe's Pub in New York. Radical access wasn't an add-on, but was core to Fishback's work of making connections across forms, issues, and troubles. Quote, "According to Alison Coppett, the show's access dramaturg, integrated access is creatively structured into the core of the show and is tied to the show's values and purpose." So for today, the main idea I'm going to share for you about my review of his work is that if things feel like they're connected for you, then they are. And the work of art or visual culture in the process of decolonizing is to make those connections clear for yourself, for others, for activism, for movements, and to build connections. So here's a quote from my piece from Dan. It's long, and then I'll end. He says, "It was the fall of 2023, and I was in a daily panic, as many of us were, asking ourselves, what are the ways that I can exert power right now? Because a genocide was accelerating and consent was being manufactured. My body felt like it was on fire, taken over by the images and the video feeds of the genocide unfolding in front of me. I had to ask myself, how am I going to make good on my commitments to write a show that is largely about my own illness, while also engaging with this?" He says, "I relied on the tools Deb Margolin gave me, which are old split britches tools. If you're obsessed with more than one thing at the same time, they're connected. It's just a matter of juxtaposing them and finding out what the connection is. In this case, the overlap was alienation." He goes on to say, "COVID and Palestine are 2 situations where the government and all of our major institutions are saying, everything's fine. No need to get worked up. You don't have to act. And in both situations, I know that nothing's fine. even though the rest of the world is just going about their business. So I end my piece by saying, Dan Fishback's Jewish Crip aesthetic, art made with a framework of disability justice, anti-Zionism, and integrated access, is rooted in the human, or we might hope Jewish, capacity to be generous, and so much more. He expands our understanding of who is in the room, who is in the world, who is in our community, who lives at the same time at us, but in a different way. This connection in his show between chronic illness and Palestine, from a Jewish perspective, is not only about alienation, it is about identification and solidarity. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. And I want to pass the mic to Gil.
Sorry, I had problems unmuting. Thank you. Thank you for all of those present here and for everybody organizing this. And very glad to join the conversation. So I didn't prepare very well, but I'll do my very best to start with addressing the first question. Which is my contribution. It's a little bit hard to contextualize it right now, but I will try. So when I initially, for our initial conversation, was invited kindly by Nick and Jill, I had a little bit, some hesitations about the framework and wanted to ask us all to ask what it really means to do decolonial Jewish work. And I think, you know, it's obviously complex. We can talk about it in Q&A because what decolonial means, what Jewish means is of course different things to not just to the participants, but to everybody in the audience. For the written piece, I chose to focus on a first part of a trilogy by the Israeli-German artist Yael Bartana called Mari Kusmari, Nightmares. And just for those of you who haven't had a chance to see this, this is a trilogy about an invented Jewish Renaissance movement in Poland that the artist has built several works of art around, including later, a few years later, an actual summit of 3 days that was part of the Berlin Biennale, in which the discussion of whether the idea of returning 3,300,000 Jews to Poland as part of this movement is something that Jews, Israelis, and Poles can collaborate on as an actual political idea and, so to speak, solution to past crimes and perhaps present crimes. Very briefly, because I didn't really select parts to read, but very briefly, I would mention that at the time when the work came out, which was 2011, the sort of dominant reading, I would say, at least by Jewish critics, was to frame the work as in a frame of analogy. So to suggest that Bartana's suggestion or the Polish call for Jewish return was really to be read analogically as the Jewish call for Palestinian return. I then in the piece questioned that analogical reading, and I have some suggestions about the kind of violence that it does, but I also say that at the time I questioned it from different places, while revisiting this piece now in light of the genocide in Gaza and in light of which is as we all know has actually not the genocide, specifically genocide on Gaza and destruction of Gaza, has been having systematically since what Ariel Sharon considered the separation plan, right? So the sort of separation plan, and from then on, every 2 years, a constant bombardment and destruction, which up until 2014 barely got any visual attention in Western media. But the rebels and the destruction and death was always there. So later, what I basically, my engagement in the written piece is to suggest that what I do find very effective in Bertana's work right now at this moment is that it allows us to do two things. One, it allows us to look at the limitations of a kind of simplistic model of, we can solve things by somehow pretending that we can really reverse history, that we can really do some kind of population exchange, that is really a viable solution. At the same time, I think by sort of presenting us with this model and presenting it in a very aesthetically compelling way, which is part of my argument, I think the work forces us to stick with this sort of dream or vision of return and repair, but asks ourselves, what would it mean to do that beyond and against the limitations of the framework of the nation state, which I think is what we must continue to do. And yes, we are, of course, in a situation where we have one nation and one non-nation occupied population, and therefore the drive to speak or adopt national symbols or national discourse of emancipation is almost inevitable and almost natural. Nevertheless, I am suggesting that Israel, as a nation state of refugees, is precisely what we need to take as the example of a failed process of what happens when emancipation and reparation and salvation takes the form of an ethno-nation state. And that is something we need to keep alive as a warning. And I will say it is not an easy thing to do, precisely when you are not on, the side of the deprived of nationality. But nevertheless, I believe that politically, it is what, in my mind, is a decolonial Jewish practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gil. Really beautifully articulated and so important. I'm going to pass the mic to Laura.
Hi, everyone. Really great to be here together. And I think that for me has been the inspiration for my contribution, both to the panel that we did at CAA and then subsequently to the piece that I wrote for the journal. I was really moved when we stood in the room at the College Art Association that winter day to see such a group of standing room only wonderful humans really being together in spirit and in action, and a desire to actually think and do together. And it inspired me in the moment. I had planned to say something parallel but different. It inspired me to really share for the first time in great detail the story of my resignation from the Queen's Museum in 2018 and or 2019, I should say. What unfolded there, and you can read the piece in the journal. There's also a version of it that's up now on Hyperallergic. And so I won't go into all of the details again now because I think you can get a sense of that. But I was targeted in a very specific way. And I want to share a few thoughts about that targeting because I think that the name of the piece is a canary in a coal mine, or a canary story, because I do feel like this series of events that happened to me throughout 2018 and 2019 actually is a sort of foreshadowing to what many more people are going to experience and have experienced since then and going forward. And so, I think that part of what is at stake is, especially for those of us who live in relative comfort and privilege within our own universes where there aren't bombs dropping, at least not yet, in spite of the other precarities that we're faced with, is the relative swiftness of the potential for things to radically change. And one of there was a moment that I write about in the piece, when my husband said to me, Laura, I think you're going to have to recognize that you might never work in a museum again. And in that moment, I felt completely like shocked. I was like, I couldn't imagine that reality because until then I had really thought of myself as someone who worked inside of museums and in cultural spaces, and I couldn't imagine that reality. And so making space for that imagination and what that might look like was actually part of the radical act that I had to go through to actually make the decision to leave. And I think that is something that we're seeing reflected now. Before the session began, we were talking about Mark Bray's decision as a scholar of anti-fascism to leave the United States, his attempt to leave and being stopped at the airplane and then being only allowed to leave the country a few days later. But just the contingencies that one has to think about and imagine as a mode of survival. And I think one of the things that I was so challenging for me was that I felt so very alone in that moment of making those decisions. And I just want to say that in this moment, we need to be together and we need to stand in solidarity with one another in ways that we haven't experimented with before. And I'm working on a project now that I just want to share with this amazing audience of people called Fall of Freedom, which is a national call to enact culture as resistance to fascism, to the rise of fascism in the United States. Obviously, it's not limited to the United States. Obviously, we have great, problems across the globe. However, we need to stand up somewhere, and where we live is as good a place as any. So I encourage you to visit that website, falloffreedom.com, and just check out what we're doing. This isn't necessarily meant to be a promotion for that event, but to say that this work comes out of a desire to create those networks of solidarity so that we can stand up to all the things that have to be resisted. Because as all of my colleagues said, Palestine is interrelated and interwoven into all of the problematic structures that we see at play in our world. And if we have any hope of undoing, redoing, remaking, and even just envisioning what that world might look like, we have to do it through our own imaginations and together. And so I just want to offer that it's a place to start. And I know that many of us have been doing work for many years before now, but this, as Nick said at the very outset, is an inflection point. And I do believe that at inflection points, it is the kind of creative act and the artistic moment and the gesture and the that opening of the imagination that we experience when we have a cultural experience, an experience of great art that enables us to do that. And oftentimes that happens in a way across geography, across identity, and across life experience. And so anyway, I just want to make an invitation to everyone to sit in that place with us, because we need our comrades beyond allyship, beyond, beyond locking arms. It is at this point, I really believe that this is a spiritual journey that we are on, and that is the depth of our interconnection.
Oh, thank you for that, Laura. The kinds of solidarities I think that we're talking about are solidarities of love and risk, and claiming the spiritual and moral feels really urgent. With that, we wanted to ask each of you what you would want to add now. Laura, I know you've started to add, but I think that there's more. So I was hoping, Alex, we might start with you about what you would want to add now to what you contributed to the roundtable that's forthcoming in the Journal of Visual Culture.
So I don't need to add more about Dan's piece. I really enjoyed learning with him from the piece, but also as an interlocutor. I wanted to talk a little bit about what has changed for me. I think it might be useful at this moment, which is what happens when we learn from each other, when we learn from people who are braver than us. So I was really very scared to speak in public as a professor from an anti-Zionist position, one that I've had for a long time. And when push came to shove, I would do it in a political situation. But many of you in this room have been doing it for years. And I watched you, I learned from you, I looked at your courage, and I was silenced by bullies and aggressive forces that wanted me to be afraid. At some point, on Jill's invitation and Nick's to join this panel, when people were being murdered and starved, my fear was ridiculous. And my following their attempts to silence me by scaring me with their bullying behaviors no longer felt tenable. But I had to learn from Gil, I'm just going to name Jill, Nick, other people that I see in this audience, but particularly from Dan Fishback, also as anti-Zionist Jew who's suffering a chronic illness, who was willing to make these connections in his public work, even though he was sick, even as he was tired. And I just want to say to the rest of you, as soon as I made that real leap into the public, I really regret how long I was afraid. And I really am so pleased to be publicly in conversation with allies, to say that these connections, this solidarity work, to be visible from this position, to learn and change as an anti-Zionist Jew from each other, is part of the important grounding we can do in the United States, at least, in solidarity with people who are suffering in such extraordinary ways in Palestine. And so I want to add an invitation for us not to be afraid of fascist censorship and aggression, even because that is what it wants us to be, and to not be a dupe to that project, to resist that project. It feels great on the other side. And I thank Jill and Nick for producing the possibility for me to write from this position and speak from this position. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Oh, well, and then there's also being afraid and doing it anyway. Thank you so much, Alex. Gil, I'm wondering what you may want to add at this inflection point, as Nick put it.
Thank you. So like everybody else, it's of course feels good to be with allies and recognize that we are in this together. I think with this, and because I feel safe in this group and solid enough, I do want to acknowledge that we are coming from different positionalities ourselves. I do want to acknowledge that for me, of course, the study of, it's the sort of Zionism in Palestine has been my entire academic career, my entire activism, but also my entire life as somebody who grew up in Israel, somebody who has family in Israel, and somebody for whom the term anti-Zionist I used way before it was used in my first book in 1997. But now that it became such a popular term, I am less inclined to use that particular term because I no longer know what it means. I know what it means for American Jews in terms of configuring an identity for American Jews. But I don't know what it means. And I think I mentioned it in our meeting in the winter. I do think that we need to think a little bit about our terms globally, not just in relation to Israel, but also in relation to Jews in Europe, and understand or ask ourselves, what is Americanized about this particular process? The terms that we use, the identities that we are speaking about. And it's not said, obviously I'm here, I'm part of this, I am seeing, I am part of what I recognize as my people. But I also am somebody who, am just in terms of my career and where I come from, and my daily context, my students, my friends are both Palestinians, some from Gaza, some from the West Bank, and of course Israelis, as my family is. And within that context, these terms do still come across as specifically part of an American project. Now, the reason I think we need to reflect on it is because we are people who are preoccupied with questions of power and discourse, and we need to ask ourselves, where are we coming into this conversation? So on this place, what I would like to say is that there is a group of a solid group of a few thousand Israelis, Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. These are not the ones that you see in all the pictures of the demonstrations that have many, many people in the hostage square. These are people who have long before October 7 they are fighting occupation. They are anti-Zionist in the sense that they are strong supporters of a one-state solution, which is obviously not the direction of where we're seeing things happen. I do find the sort of absence of those figures. Oli Noy, for example, somebody who you might have heard of because she's very dominant. The absence of those figures in sort of the American anti-Zionist left stages to be concerning. Also, just it throws into question to me the ways in which we want to make what for some of us is primarily maybe a question of identity, of, I don't know, different journeys, whether spiritual or a journey to, save a kind of Judaism from what is for some people a day-to-day reality of living under a a fascist regime. We think we're there. We are not there yet, in the sense that we can still do more than what some of these people do. And I don't think that, I think we need to find ways to give more presence to that. The last thing I want to say, as somebody who is in touch with many people who are currently on Gaza, including the person that you probably all know, Bissam Auda, who continues to, has all the Instagrams, I am still alive. What I hear as a message is, please stop presenting us as only victims and like no sort of like homo sacer. And so I hear that, and I hear the plea from my students. I work with Palestinian students regularly. I work with students in Amman, and I think we also need to be very careful about situating the project and being very, very honest with ourselves about what are the things that we're doing, because we need to save our souls, frankly, and our heritage, and as Alex said, our families, our memories, and what it is that when we recognize, as Nick said, to recognize people as real, need to listen to what they want from us. And I am getting a sense that we and I'm sure we all know about it, but this is not a critique as much as a real call for dialogue for the people present in this meeting to reflect on it, because it's a very complicated position to be doing this. But if we want to recognize that people as real, we need to be very, very tuned to what these people want from us or not want from us as part of our own search and our own identities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are the kind of questions that I just naturally, because of my daily interactions, my switching from Hebrew to Arabic, I cannot but not ask these questions all the time. So I just wanted to share it with all of you, with hope that everybody understands that this is a call to a conversation, not a critique.
Thank you so much for that, Gil. And Laura, do you want to
I just
add?
have one small thing to add, which takes off from what Gil was just talking about, and which relates to a project I'm engaged with called the Experimental Potluck that I'm trying to realize with Emily Josser in Bethlehem in the West Bank, and the misunderstanding of that project, which I think is very telling about also the way that such collaborations are received. And I will explain it very simply by saying the idea was to create a transcontinental neighborhood. And how do you do that? Well, neighbors have potlucks. I mean, it's like a stupid idea, right? But sometimes stupid ideas make good things come out of stupid ideas. So, we thought, okay, well, how do we inspire one another across geographies, across differences in material realities, and across differences in privileges? And maybe we all bring something to the table in whatever way that we can. And no one's excluded from that, everyone's included. And so obviously I'm being very broad here, but my point still you'll see where I'm getting to with this in a sec. So, as we've tried in this impossible fundraising environment to try to find support for this project to, at Emily's invitation, bring a group of people to Palestine in this moment, very importantly, in this moment, to bring people to Palestine, to have this potluck, whatever that might mean. And I can talk about that more, but The response was, well, yeah, no, we're just giving money to get food to people. And I was like, that's great. You should be giving money to get food to people. But you also have to understand that people need more than food. And the call to us from people living in the conditions of the West Bank said to us, we don't get to travel like you do with your passport. We don't get to go to the conferences that you get to go to because you have that privilege of that passport. We would like for people to come. Obviously, we would like to travel, but you can't allow us to do that. Will you come here to share ideas with us so that we can inform your practice, importantly, but also so that we can hear how you're surviving and your geography? And so this exchange, it is not about, it's about sharing knowledges, sharing space, sharing time, developing the kinds of relationships both in advance of such a visit and also during. The mechanics of the thing don't really matter. I mean, yes, they do, of course they matter, but just the beginning point of it is to say it's an invitation to, it was an invitation from me and my colleague, my collaborators, and Emily saying, this is what we need now. And we need it now. We don't need it 5 years from now when, there's still rubble and we need it now. And so the urgency of that was not heard because there is still exactly what Gil was talking about. The assumptions of what is needed are really narrow and do not encompass a full humanity. And that is just what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Laura. We're about to move to open things up to Q&A in about 5 minutes. And so we don't have a lot of time, but we did want to raise the questions of where are the visible signs of protest? How do we engage as visual activists, scholars, educators now? How do we work to not forget the genocide, but also respond to the ways that you have also already reframed that question of what are the particular relationalities that we're going to be building in not making this some kind of one-sided endeavor. So I don't know if Alex, Gil, Laura, you had some additional thoughts, or Nick, if you wanted to add something at this juncture as well.
I prepared something brief, but
Great.
I'd love to hear
Thank you,
I'd actually
Alex.
like to hear from Nick first.
Okay, I always do what Alex tells me to do. This is a good rule in life. My general sense is that we want diversity of tactics. We've always, I think as social movements over the last 2 decades, we've worked in that frame. People should work where they are. And how one defines where you are is, of course, not as simple a question as it may seem sometimes. So I don't think that any of the things that we've heard here are necessarily contradictory, but there are places where people are working out the work that they have to do. And that comes from very different backgrounds. And everybody's spoken here, it seems to me, to personal genealogies. So let me do that a little bit. I found myself the other weekend on a march for Jewish elders. And this is about an unlikely a thing that I could do as I can possibly imagine, except with the exception of Alex going to a Seder. And this was on the Upper West Side. It was probably quite close to where you live, Gil. And so it's 2 weeks ago, and the conflict within that space was physical. There were other Jewish elders who ran off the sidewalk, yelled at us, and then started to try and mix it up. But because they were Jewish elders, they immediately collapsed, and ambulances had to arrive, and it was kind of chaotic scene. So my sense, there's a sense in which I think we have worked hard over this last 2 years to kind of create a possible identity, but we're also aware of the ways, have to become aware of the ways in which for other people that hasn't worked at all. And that there is this kind of literally this physical conflict going on. I mean, so I started to think about, what my journey has been a little bit different to some others in that I've been anti-Zionist for a long time, but I would never use the noun Jew in relationship to myself. I would always say Jewish or Jewish descent or something like that. So that's where I started out, and this is something that many of you been on that journey. But now I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in this question of decentering my own subjectivity now and thinking about how structural Jewishness works. And I mean that's in the case of something like the 2018 law in Israel, where only people who are identified as Jewish can claim full citizenship, and how that structuring is increasingly informing other forms of claims to racializing hierarchy. So we're seeing that in this country. Obviously, there's a court case working its way through in Australia where two Jewish faculty are suing two other Jewish faculty on the idea that and their claim to be anti-Zionist is structurally anti-Semitic. And we've all encountered that here in different ways. But once Australia tends to start these things on anti-immigration and anti-identity and those kinds of, they were barricading the country in 2001 to prevent people from migrating there in small boats, which has become an issue now in Europe. So I think we want to watch that because I think that will inevitably come here. So that then it's more of, to me now, it's that I think we want to work from, or I want to work, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. I want to work from that place of individualizing to now a place of thinking about how this Jewishness is a structure, not an event.
Nick, that's so helpful to me because my Jewishness is unfindable for me, as you know. But also it has been my responsibility in this time to know it enough to speak from that position so others won't speak for me. I think the thing I wanted to say, again, quite briefly here, again, learning with Dan Fishback, his piece, and work and writing about it is this idea of making connections across trouble, across trauma, across need is not the same thing as equating. And that's where the troubles we are having, say, for instance, as academics writ large, then as people identified as Jewish or self-identified as Jewish being used in a destruction of academia in the United States is not commensurate to nor equatable to what is happening in Palestine or Israel at this moment. But we also need to make those connections. They are connectable. And so how do we make connections of solidarity, of communion, without flattening difference and honoring the immensity of that tragedy, while also understanding that there's incredible tragedy now also occurring in the United States where we work, where we live, in our streets, to our neighbors. So I think that is the work of visual culture. I think it's the work of scholars, that those are very nuanced, historical and lived connections. So that's what I'd add. I do want to say, we all know that the resistance is very visible right now. It's been visible differently again for 2 years. The work of artists is part of that resistance. The work of cultural producers is part of that resistance. But organizing on the street, which all of us are doing, you just were with the elders. I'm organizing constantly at Brooklyn College, where 4 of my colleagues were fired this summer for their beliefs about Palestine, and 6 of my colleagues are being scrutinized for potentially being on the quad. They're called the Fired 4 and the Singed 6. Please look into that, Brooklyn College. We're protesting constantly how we can draw connections between those 10 colleagues having that fascist oppression occurring to them, to connections across other universities of the US, in the world. That is our work as intellectuals, and communicating that in ways that other people can understand and connect to, I think, is also what we can do as cultural workers and as intellectual workers.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. Chloe, do we have a moment if Gil or Laura wanted to add something before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, and if you have a question in the audience, please submit it at the form in the chat, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can shortly.
Very fast. Gil,
yeah. Very,
Laura,
very
did you
fast.
want to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, very, very fast. So again, yeah, I agree. I think that it's good to talk about all these different positions, because we are, that's part of where we start the work, by actually, recognizing that we're all pulled in here. I do think that the personal is very strong. I think it's always the case. I think I had this conversation with Alex once, which is that for me, Judaism, because I grew up in an observant household, for me, Judaism is not like, it's a very clear thing. It's like, you don't eat pork, you do this, you do this, you do this. And even if I wanted, in my wildest dreams, as, queer as I can be, that part I can't shake, right? So like when something bad happens, I immediately ask forgiveness from the above. I would never in my life eat pork, because I do believe that despite the fact that it's completely not rational, fire will break and I will be consumed at that very moment. But it's actually, for me, that kind of part is something that is, whether ironic or just good, is actually been a source of a lot of direct connections with people in the Middle East. And I think that one of the things that for me is always astonishing is really the fact that I think for me at least, and that's maybe I'll end, is that the problem is always and always has to be, or that's kind of where my mind frame is, white European Christians. I'm not saying they're all bad, obviously, but that's structurally speaking. So when Nick talked about Judaism as structure, because Judaism for me is so corporeal, I can't even think about it as structure. But Christianity is the structure by which we live, whether we like it or not. And so I guess in that sense, I really kind of try to, or my anti-Zionism, the place that I feel the most comfortable with it is, and that's probably why I am writing the book that I've been writing for, 20 years, but hopefully eventually it will be out there, about Christian Zionism, but like sort of the guts of it, the way that we are all embedded in it, whether we like it or not, because that's for me sort of the source of the issues. And then of course Palestine and Palestinians and the Middle East are all the heaviest price for the moment. But of course, in that, I'll end with that Middle East, when we say Palestine, we do understand, I know everybody here knows, that the way in which that horrendous destruction, unspeakable destruction of Palestine has been, his roots has all found its way in the systematic destruction of the Middle East, right? So Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, to the result in which we have right now, which is that the Gulf in the US are in control, but we don't have to do a whole political analysis just to say that it's a big thing. I know everybody here knows it, and that's why I think it's important to always make these connections. Anti-Zionism is not just about Israel. It's about something a lot bigger than that.
Thank you, Gil. Exactly. And Laura, did you want to super briefly add something before we go to Q&A?
Let's just go to the questions. Let's get into the questions.
All right. Thank you all so much for your questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. The first question is from Shira. Shira asks, would you consider a framework without pro and anti that invites complexity and understanding of differences and empathy?
Shara, I would so appreciate that. I embrace the term anti-Zionist in this moment because it was a place to converge, but it doesn't often allow for me to make the cross-Jewish connections that I think are quite important right now. And in organizing work that I've done with my colleagues who are Jews at Brooklyn College, we have used other terms precisely to draw a slightly larger tent that will bring in many more of my Jewish colleagues who have strong opinions about what is happening in Israel, what is happening in Palestine, as scholars in the field and as Jews who are not. I think it's contextual. So I think if it's an organizing tool, how we embrace these names, we can think about when they allow us safety and a place to think, and when we need to let those words go so that we can have safety and a place to think with other people. So I was using non-Zionist for a while, but I think we're intellectuals here. Naming matters, but we don't want to get stuck in it either.
I might add on this note, because I think this is important. I mean, when Biden was talking about going around saying, I am a Zionist, and supplying enormous amounts of United States funding to create the genocide, I think it was really important for people to be against that. But I don't think we were ever against people. I think solidarity is about being for people. So that, we're pro-Palestinian and we're against structures. Now, how we name those structures, and that's part of the conversation here, is, as Alex just said, this is the work that we do. And those structures necessarily change, although they're also part of a long history. I want to underscore one thing, though, which is that I think we are always going to want to be anti-capitalist. So once we become pro-capitalist, then I think we're in, or even if we're nuancing capitalism, then I think we lost some of that framework. I also want to just say personally, I mean, just like Jill has, I see Debbie Farber in the room, who is from Zochrot, which is the Decolonial project in Israel, who helped me and showed me around and introduced me to people. And I've worked with folks like Eyal Wetzman, who are part of that group too. So there's a dynamic within the 48 that is about thinking through these issues. And yes, it's a small segment, as Gil said, but it can be crucially part of helping us shape and form our understanding. And finally, I think we have to listen to what Palestinians ask us to do. So Palestinians have for a long time asked us to support boycott, have asked us to, and I know recently that in Haaretz, of all places, there was a call to boycott everything that comes out of Israel, I mean, including people, which is something that one couldn't imagine saying, let alone having printed in this country, given the current state of the situation there. I'm not seconding that necessarily, but I did note it. I thought it was striking. So, I mean, I think I have family in Israel too. My grandmother was in Haganah. My great uncle was in the Irgun. I mean, these are literally things that are within my body. Empathy, of course, but then we are also having to work through very complicated histories within families, and families understood in broad as well as narrow senses that can't always be empathetic. When one thinks of violence within families, one thinks of domestic violence, one thinks of sexual violence. that can't always be something that can be simply resolved through empathy, or perhaps there's again a better word that someone else will be able to supply that thinks about how do we get to a place where we think about the violence of a grandfather? How do we think about the violence of a cousin? When we've known and we've loved that person in a different context.
Does anyone else want to say anything about that question before we move to the next one? I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, I think we should.
Yeah. Okay. I have a couple of questions from Marianne. The first one is in line with Gil's caveat. I have a question about the College Art Association and the meeting where you hosted this great panel, and which I did not attend. I understand the urge to explore and articulate decolonial Jewish practices. Were there also sessions featuring Palestinian work, and were there Palestinian speakers? I'm asking this out of frustration with some other scholarly meetings I attended this year, none of which did this.
I hate to go again, but I'll just very quickly say there was very little. We felt that this was what we should be doing because, again, this is the contemporaries. So Jill and myself, this was the position from which we could work. And we thought it was important to do that. There was only one panel that I saw that was explicitly about Palestine. And it began with an absolutely catastrophic presentation that led to a lot of us walking out and some people even heckling, which is something I'm very rarely seen at something like the College Art Association. So I would kind of second Marianne's frustration with the established scholarly associations. And I mean, I know that Jill is working on a different kind of scholarly association. She might want to talk about that.
Thank you, Marianne, and hi. It's good to see you. For me, this was actually the first time attending this conference, and I didn't notice that. I was surprised at AMLA. I mean, I participated in the MLA. Although I will never attend again, but I did participate in a panel with Hanan Ashrawi and a few others, and then there were two other panels that did feature Palestinians, not just about Palestine. Of course, the only organization or conferences that I attend that do are MESAAS, the Middle East Studies Association. But I have to say that it's a little bit early for me to kind of think about it here, but there is, even within Middle East studies now, things are becoming very messy and complex, as some of you probably know, because the current situation is now done in a way that everybody in the Middle East that knows something about it knows that the Qataris in Turkey are basically already dividing the shares of the profits of this new arrangement. And all along, we've had the Gulf pretty much generating the continual supply of weapons, and it's very, very complex to the degree that I believe, just as we see in politics, I think it's trickling down. You even see it at the Columbia, at the Middle East Institution, even in terms of the funding, because we are having fights about, most of the funding is Saudi funding. So I, for example, have some oppositions to that. So in that sense, I think what is very important is, again and again, and I always try to mention it, I think Nick also, each in our own way, that that statement, Palestine as the world, is in a way true also because it really is now the site of where we see the entire ambiguity, clash, and hypocrisy of capitalist global order, in which completely undid the kind of imaginary of the 2000s of the Arab world versus the rest of the world, or the global south and the global north, because they don't operate like this anymore. It's just, it's very hard to really sort of do that context. I'll just end by saying that because I'm not a political theorist, I have asked two of my colleagues who are political theorists, who know all of this, to please write something that will just make it all at least visible to us, because we kind of don't have the language, I think, to talk about what is happening, or using kind of languages that either belong to Cold War or belong to just to earlier times, and where kind of, I at least feel that it's so hard to, I mean, this particular genocide and the way it's been manufactured is just sort of it needs such a we need vocabulary. So I know, Mariana, it's beyond what you've asked, but it sort of took me there. Sorry.
Mariana, I did want to say that the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, SCMS, which I am a member of, and is my go-to meeting, not CAA, we're actually a group of us, a large group of people are boycotting it this year and producing an alternative conference in relationship to really bad decisions that the board made in the last year and previous years around Palestinian representation, around anti-Zionist discourse, and also connected, again, making connections, not being accessible and open-hearted to our trans colleagues who were afraid to travel to the United States from abroad, and were making policies that weren't allowing them to engage digitally. So in this case, trans rights and mobility, and Palestinian and anti-Zionist discourse. So an alternative conference this year.
Thank you all for those answers. I want to try to get to two more questions. We might go a little past 2:30, just making sure that's okay with all of our speakers. Okay, and then we'll ask two more. Okay, so the next question is from Talia. What is the role of visibly anti-Zionist Jewish artists to this movement? How do we reconcile reclaiming Jewish identity, discrediting Israel's misrepresentation of Jewishness in our work, with making sure we're not taking up too much space in the conversation, considering the silencing and devaluing of Palestinian perspectives?
Well, I would just want to perhaps respond to that one, in that I think it resonates with Mariana's question as well, in that it could be seen that we're taking up space. We're holding a convening to present a way of holding space, holding onto each other, to insist on taking responsibility for the ways in which we're being used. It has felt critical, and still feels critical, to make space to be, call it by other names if you will, but a refusal, a no, to the equation of undoing of the structures of the Zionist state, as well as Zionist Christianity, and to be able to do so as Jews, whether that's a practice, a belief, a history, a claiming. I mean, I would insist that putting this in an imperative, we have to answer to the ways in which we're claimed and used. So much of the violence is being done in our name and the names of those we've lost. And so I think that there is a way to do that, though, that is not a replacement. That is in deep alliance with and risking with, rather than this presumption that there's only one place. And I think that the point is to do this in deep risking solidarity.
Can I just add one very quick, Talia, that for me, the answer, I think it's a very important question. I ask myself a lot, but I think if one has the conviction, at least I do, that there are, like Edward Said's essay, Zionism from the perspective of the victims, they're only victims. They're just the ones that find out later, It's not like I'm not drawing this analogy to make an analogy, but it's like saying, if Hitlerism was good for the Germans. Obviously, it was not good for the Germans. It just took time for some to realize that. So I think if that's also the source of solidarity, because nothing good comes out of it. And with that said, we and that we don't have time for that, but that's the whole question of boycott. Because for me, I'm not saying boycott or not boycott, but for me, the where it becomes a kind of taking space is if we are not talking to those who do not agree with us, right? So for me, it is very important to talk to people who identify as Zionists. Very, very important, and to understand their emotional attachment, and to understand their political attachment. Without that, this work, as far as I'm concerned, is empty. So that would be my answer, is what to do.
I'm going to move to the last question, and I truly apologize if we weren't able to get to your question today. There are so many great questions, but Marian had asked about the after Gaza in the title for this event, saying we all know what that means in academia, but are we after, and after what? Gaza is present, and I worry about this formulation now and would love to know what you all think.
Well, Mariana, that's a essential question. We had a lot of debate amongst ourselves and also with the journal about, for example, putting after Gaza in quotation marks, which is how it actually appears in the title of the forthcoming roundtable in the journal. But the question marks are implied in setting it in quotation would be also a way of saying that, of course, as we know, with so much of, I think we know, with so much of what it is to say after, it is not to say not present or gone, but in the referencing so much the wonderful work of Christina Sharp in the wake of a genocide that has to be acknowledged as shifting how we work. And so there is a risk in the after somehow being poached or taken to mean erasure or religion, but at the same time, the risk seemed important to take as a way of saying that there are also potentials in this after for a free Palestine, just to put it bluntly, that we are in solidarity, wanting to keep alive in our praxis.
Does anyone else want to say anything before we close the Q&A? All right, well, I just want to thank you all again for this conversation, and I believe we're going to close today with a reading from Gil and Nick. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to them to close us out.
Nick, did you want to go first, or would you like me to?
Sure, I can do that. So I'm going to read a poem by Omar Jaja, who has a book out that I recommend to everyone in this room called Terms of Servitude, about Silicon Valley and digital settler colonialism, which is well worth our reading. And this poem is called A Poem Joins the Resistance. A poem has nothing to lose. A poem is the best shot. A poem smokes too many cigarettes. A poem looks directly at the sun. A poem breathes return. A poem births poet armies. A poem sweats defiance. A poem hijacks consciousness. A poem takes no prisoners. A poem frees the people. A poem won't take it easy. A poem frees the land. A poem won't. Just a minute. A poem eats apartheid walls and shits on genocide's finery. And I will post a link.
Yes, go ahead.
So people can access that poem.
What I'd like to read an excerpt from is Being the Negative, a small, beautiful book by Basil Abbas and Ron Abu Rahmeh. It's part of a collection of interventionist books published by Bilnaz, their collaborative imprint in 2024. The book is Being the Negative. Being in the negative is being excess, excess that is invisible, excess that is disposable, excess as hypervisibility, reduced to pixel and noise. Being in the negative is being in debt, in the minus, captive to a system of dispossession. Being in the negative is being in the lack, in the break, in the site of extraction. The negative is that which is unwanted, undesirable. Being in the negative is being short on breath, losing breath. Being the negative is creating from within the lack what is lacking, what is missing, what we need. We are in the lack and we are what is lacking. Being the negative is to see in the negative what we otherwise could not perceive. The pores of the land, the fracture at the heart of the colony. Being the negative is being the spill, being the contamination, being the excess that fuels return. Being the negative is to be the debt that is owed to us. Being the negative is being with what we are indebted to. All those that came before us and call to us now, call to us from within their graves, those who chant, do not die. The call echoes, call us again and again to where we must be. Being the negative is being what seems buried but continues to sprout. Being the negative is to see the breaks as openings, to be that break, breathing and being and breathing where you should not be.
Wow, thank you both so much for those readings to close us out today. And I would like to give a very huge thank you to Laura, to Alexandra, to Gil, to Jill, and to Nicholas for today's conversation. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation, who sponsored the New Social Environment program and make conversations every weekday possible for the Brooklyn Rail. And they also support our archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you happen to be free tomorrow at 1 p.m., I'm the lucky host of a conversation with Lee Mary Manning, Erica Baum, and Mary Lum on the occasion of their exhibition Now's Your Chance at Bureau. It's a Rail tradition to bid farewell to our guests at the end of the program. And today I encourage everyone who's here to turn on your cameras and join the Rail team in waving goodbye. Thank you for being in this space with us today, and we hope to see you soon.